Reading the Times for Friday, January 24th, 2020. Democrats seek to preempt Trump's defense trial. Democrats seek to preempt Trump's defense and impeachment trial. At a Republican National Committee event on Thursday evening at the President's Club in Doral, Florida, he told 400 people that the proceedings were impeachment light compared with the trial of President Bill Clinton in 1999 and the case against President Richard M. Nixon in the 1970s. Democrats expect to wrap up their case on Friday with presentations aimed at proving the second charge at Mr. Trump obstructed Congress by withholding documents and witnesses and otherwise working to conceal his behavior. No president has ever used his office to compel a foreign nation to help him cheat in our elections, Mr. Nadler said, adding, "It puts even President Nixon to shame." Mr. Nadler also turned to Trump allies, including Alan M. Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor, who's assisting in the president's defense, and Mr. Graham, who, to make his case using video clips of their comments from the Clinton impeachment trial to undercut Mr. Trump's defense. Now testifying for the prosecution, President Trump. In his presentation on Thursday, Mr. Schiff played about a half dozen video clips of Mr. Trump, including one of the president on the south lawn of the White House on October 3rd, speaking with reporters who asked him what he was hoping to get Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to do when they talked by telephone on July 25th. Why did President Trump's own officials, not so-called never-Trumpers, but public servants, report this in real time? Mr. Schiff asked, referring to the mixing of politics with Ukraine policy. In one, Mr. Trump told reporters there was a lot of corruption having to do with the 2016 election against us. We want to get to the bottom of it. When the clip was shown, Mr. Schiff focused on the us in Mr. Trump's comment. What does that president say? Corruption against us. He is not concerned about actual corruption cases, only matters that affect him personally. But the managers had it easy the last couple of days with exclusive access to the microphone and the screens on the Senate floor, and unchallenged by either the White House legal team or senators. How Joe Biden talks about a touchy subject, his son. All along, Mr. Biden and his surrogates have argued that Mr. Trump's attacks prove that the president is most concerned about facing Mr. Biden in a general election. As the disruption continued, Mr. Biden offered his own appraisal of the heckler. He's an idiot. A particularly combative moment came in December at a town hall event in New Hampton, Iowa, where an 83-year-old man took issue with Mr. Biden's age and then proceeded to accuse him falsely of having sent his son to work in Ukraine and having sold access to the president. In response to the tense exchange with the Iowa voter, a spokesman for the Republican National Committee said Mr. Biden became unglued, adding, "A hallmark of Biden's 2020 campaign is him losing it on voters and reporters when pressed about Ukraine. For his part, Mr. Biden has plenty of critical things to say about Mr. Trump, but he has publicly set a boundary for how he talks about the president." China expands virus lockdown, encircling 35 million people. Although Wuhan has taken a series of measures to ease things, there are certainly many hardships. An announcement Friday in the Hubei Daily, the province's official newspaper, indicated that the restrictions could vary from city to city. Dali Yang, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, said that while the current response has benefited from China's improved technical capabilities since the SARS crisis, what I find astounding was how the Wuhan authorities consistently downplayed the seriousness of the situation. The lessons from SARS, he said in an email, were that it's important to let the public know and get the public to modify behavior. Still, China's leaders maintain an unruffled face. On Thursday, China Central Television, the state broadcaster, treated the situation in Wuhan as a footnote in its evening newscast, one of the most watched television programs in China, airing a roughly 1-minute report on the outbreak. Annabella Sciorra testifies in Harvey Weinstein trial. He raped me. Annabella Sciorra said on the witness stand on Thursday, Harvey Weinstein raped her. Several women are expected to testify during the trial that Mr. Weinstein attacked them, though Mr. Weinstein faces charges of rape and criminal sexual act based on the allegations of only 2 women. Ms. Sciorra's encounter with Mr. Weinstein also happened too long ago to be charged as a rape, but the prosecutors are using her testimony to bolster a charge of a predatory sexual assault. Andy Byford resigns as New York City subway chief. Mr. Byford's new role would focus solely on day-to-day running of the service instead of more ambitious projects, Mr. Byford wrote. Mr. Byford's colleagues at the MTA believe Mr. Byford's high profile may have irked Mr. Cuomo. Mr. Cuomo dismissed claims that disagreements led Mr. Byford to resign, indicating that plans to reorganize the transit agency and take some responsibilities away from Mr. Byford may have contributed to his decision. UN court orders Myanmar to protect Rohingya Muslims, rejecting arguments made by Myanmar's civilian leader Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. The International Court of Justice at The Hague ruled on Thursday that Myanmar must take action to promote Rohingya Muslims, which have been killed and driven from their homes in what the country's accusers call a campaign of genocide. The court said Myanmar must take all measures within its power to prevent its military or others from carrying out genocidal acts against the Rohingya, who it said faced real and imminent risk. It also essentially put Myanmar under court oversight, telling it to submit regular reports to the tribunal, explaining what steps it had taken. The court, headed by Judge Abdulkawi Ahmed Yusuf of Somalia, also ordered Myanmar to report back within 4 months on what steps it had taken to preserve evidence relevant to the genocide case, and to submit further reports to the court every 6 months after that for as long as the case remains open. Afghanistan is ready for major U.S. troop reduction, Ghani says. An official summary of his Wednesday meeting with Mr. Ghani made no mention of a ceasefire, instead citing the need for a significant and lasting reduction in violence by the Taliban. But Mr. Ghani's government has insisted on pushing the Taliban for nothing short of a ceasefire to show that the insurgents are genuine about peace and negotiating a shared political future, saying that a reduction of violence is meaningless. In a response that signaled how fraught any direct talks between the Afghan government and insurgents would be, a former Taliban minister alluded to the barbarity that predated the Taliban governments of the 1990s. Agha Jan Motasim, who was finance minister during the Taliban government, said all sides of the 40-year conflict, including the Taliban, had made mistakes. Salvini remains at the eye of Italy's political storm. A nationalist turn. A victory in Calabria would also clearly signal the national reach of Mr. Salvini's League, a party born as a northern secessionist movement that exalted an imaginary region called Padania. Mr. Bonaccini has himself urged voters to recall that Mr. Salvini is not on the ballot and that Ms. Borgonzoni, who picked fights with France over Leonardo da Vinci's paintings as a Ministry of Culture under Secretary, and who struggled to name Emilia-Romagna's bordering regions in a radio interview, was the ghost candidate. After January 26, Salvini will leave. Mr. Bonaccini, who has not included his party's symbol in campaign posters, has repeatedly said, for Mr. Salvini, the substance of the remarks is often Matteo Salvini. EU farm chief pledges to tackle corruption in subsidy program. The European Union's new top agricultural official promised on Thursday to introduce anti-corruption measures in response to a New York Times investigation that revealed how the bloc's huge farm subsidy program underwrites a system of political patronage and land grabbing. Some of the European lawmakers who write the subsidy policy also benefit personally from the program, a situation that is allowed by Europe's weak and murky conflict of interest rules. Mr. Wojciechowski reiterated his office's long-standing support for a subsidy cap, a measure intended to reduce the amount of subsidies that go to the biggest farmers. Wuhan, beyond the coronavirus, steals cars and spicy noodles. Wuhan, an industrial city in central China, straddles a river, the Yangtze. The two walked along the city's east lake, building what Chinese state-run media came to call the Wuhan spirit between the two regional rivals. As China took off in the modern era, local leaders tried to burnish the city's image and show Wuhan taking part in the country's rise. Coronavirus deaths are so far mostly older men, many with previous health issues. China's Health Commission, which has tightly controlled news about the toll of the outbreak, on Thursday released details about the first 17 confirmed deaths from the disease. Dr. Yuan Yi, a professor of infectious diseases at the University of Hong Kong, who visited Wuhan this week, warned that there was a potential for the virus to spread rapidly despite the controls put in place on Thursday morning. The path of the coronavirus could prove harder to trace and control than SARS, when a small number of highly infectious superspreaders helped transmit the disease to a large number of people, Dr. Guan said. Texas student may have Wuhan coronavirus as dozens in U.S. are monitored. A Texas A&M University student was being isolated at home on Thursday, as health officials said they were examining whether he could be the second known case of Wuhan coronavirus in the United States. The man had traveled from Wuhan, China, where the outbreak of the respiratory illness began, and healthcare providers determined that he met the criteria for coronavirus testing. Health officials in Brazos County, Texas, said, while assuring the public that there was little threat. Officials have said the patient in Washington state would most likely not be the last Wuhan coronavirus case to reach the United States. The case of the 5 missing dogs. What happened to the Tamworth 5? Miss Lawford put the health and welfare of dogs in her care at risk, she said in the offenses, which included breaching conditions attached to her license and failing to provide veterinary care for a dog that had a skin infection. Of particular curiosity is that Miss Parsons' dog, Maddie, a 6-year-old pug mix, and Pablo, a 7-year-old black pug, were not the only dogs to disappear under Miss Lawford's care that day. Miss Parsons said that she received a phone call on July 30th from someone who claimed to be close to Miss Lawford and said the dogs were dead. The person said the call was to put us out of our torture and misery, Miss Parsons said. 3 U.S. firefighters die in plane crash as Australia's blazes intensify. 3 firefighters from the United States were killed on Thursday when a plane carrying fire retardant went down in the mountains south of Canberra, the Australian capital, in 2018 as California was in the grip of its worst fire season ever. More than 130 Australian and New Zealand wildfire experts traveled there and to the Pacific Northwest to battle blazes, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. Some of the visiting firefighters have been a part of elite ground crews, but far more have arrived with experience in fire management, planning, and aviation. Bulgaria charges 3 Russian agents in poisoning case. Prosecutors in Bulgaria announced criminal charges on Thursday against 3 Russian spies from a secretive assassination unit for a 2015 poisoning of a prominent Bulgarian arms manufacturer. Members of the unit have also been involved in an attempted coup in Montenegro and an operation in Moldova. as well as the poisoning in 2018 of a former Russian spy, Sergei V. Skripal, in the English town of Salisbury. The Bulgarian government declined to expel any diplomats in the wake of the Skripal poisoning and had closed the inquiry into the Jebrev poisoning years earlier because of a lack of evidence. Africa's richest woman set to face charges in Angola over embezzlement. Mr. Dacuna's name appears extensively in the leaked documents as a banker facilitating business for Ms. Dos Santos and her husband, Sindica Docolo. Ms. Dos Santos was fired from Sonangol that day, and some of the funds were paid out after the new Angolan president, who had replaced her father, denounced her dismissal, the documents show. The recently leaked documents provide a detailed account of how Ms. Dos Santos exploited her country's resources, acquiring stakes in Angola's lucrative diamond industry, banks, its leading cement manufacturer, and its largest mobile phone company, though often through orders signed by her father. Holocaust gathering let some leaders score present-day political points. Poland's president Andrzej Duda, angered that Mr. Putin was giving a speaking slot, but he was not, stayed home. In the memorial book, Mr. Duda promised to always uphold the truth about the tragedy that struck our country, and Mr. Putin criticized efforts to distort the truth about the Second World War and rehabilitate the aggressors and their accomplices. Mr. Putin had a busy schedule on his day trip. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, met with President Emmanuel Macron of France late Wednesday and with Mr. Putin Thursday evening. Powerful winter storm in Spain kills at least 10. A powerful winter storm in Spain has killed at least 10 people after battering the country for days, destroying bridges, cutting off roads and railway lines, and flooding vast swaths of farmland. Even as the storm moved north, setting off weather alerts for parts of France, tens of thousands of people across Spain were still recovering on Thursday from driving rains and pounding waves that wreaked havoc in coastal towns and villages. Emergency services in Palamos were continuing to search for another person who is believed to have fallen into the sea, one of several people in the area still reported missing since the passage of the storm. Trump invites Netanyahu to White House to discuss Middle East peace plan. If all goes according to plan, Mr. Trump, who is on trial in the Senate on charges of high crimes and misdemeanors, will play host to Mr. Netanyahu, who has been indicted on equally high charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, and to his challenger, Mr. Gantz, who holds no government office and whose main argument to oust Mr. Netanyahu is that he has not been indicted for anything. For one thing, it is likely to shift the pre-election conversation to Israel away from Mr. Netanyahu's indictment in 3 corruption cases, and could delay or even scuttle Mr. Gantz's push for the Israeli parliament to deal speedily with Mr. Netanyahu's request for parliamentary immunity from prosecution. Mr. Netanyahu, an unparalleled political salesman, could portray the Trump proposal as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Mr. Koplow said, using that to browbeat Mr. Gantz into agreeing to enter a unity government, with Mr. Netanyahu retaining the premiership. We asked 81 Americans about impeachment. Here's what they had to say. One Democrat who thought Mr. Trump should be removed acknowledged, "I don't really know what the evidence is, but most people across the political spectrum were well versed in the basics, and some could even reel off names of key witnesses and documents. People we spoke with who said they did not want Mr. Trump to be removed from office tended to view impeachment as an intensely personal attack on the president, mounted by Democrats who despise Mr. Trump and resent his election victory in 2016. He's made fun of people. He's attacked people's ethnicity. He's attacked people's capabilities, especially making fun of people who might have severe learning issues." Even from half a world away, Pelosi keeps a tight grip on impeachment. Ms. Pelosi's role in the impeachment of Mr. Trump may be formally over, but By her own design, the matter is not out of her hands, even as the public focus has shifted to Mr. Schiff and his team of impeachment managers, who on Wednesday and Thursday began laying out their arguments for convicting Mr. Trump on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Ms. Pelosi has remained firmly in control. Ms. Pelosi's approach to the Senate trial is no different from how she handled the impeachment process when it was on her side of the Capitol. Senators battle for a persistent impeachment foe, their own restlessness. Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican of Tennessee, appeared on Fox News while her colleagues sat inside the chamber listening to a tense debate between the House impeachment managers and Mr. Trump's defense team. During the lunch break on Thursday, Senator Richard M. Burr, Republican of North Carolina, passed out fidget spinners for his 52 Republican colleagues, the better to pass the time. A precedent set in 1966 by former Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen, who grew thirsty while delivering a lengthy speech, allows senators to sip milk on the floor, a privilege several Republicans, including Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, have invoked during the trial. Justice Department says facts did not justify continued wiretap of Trump aide. The department has also promised to sequester phone calls and emails it intercepted while intruding on Mr. Page's privacy, according to a newly disclosed order by the court that oversees national security wiretaps under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. The wiretapping of Mr. Page, as part of the Russian investigation, has been a political flashpoint. The department told the court that by those final two applications, if not earlier, there was insufficient prediction to establish probable cause to believe that Page was acting as an agent of a foreign power. The department informed the FISA court about its eventual loss of confidence in the available evidence about Mr. Page as part of a December 9th letter to the court following the release of the Inspector General report. As part of that criticism, Mr. Horowitz documented that during the preparation of the final renewal application, as FBI lawyers altered an email from the CIA in a way that made it look like the agency had said Mr. Page was not a source, contributing to the department's continued failure to discuss Mr. Page's relationship with the CIA in the application. Trump moves to block visas for pregnant women on birth tourism. The State Department on Thursday gave visa officers more power to block pregnant women from visiting the United States and directed them to stop so-called birth tourism, or trips designed to obtain citizenship for their children. State Department officials holding a briefing for reporters under the condition of anonymity failed to provide an example of how birth tourism presented a national security risk, though both the State Department and the White House said that it did. In the rule, the State Department acknowledged that estimating the number of people who give birth after entering the United States with a visa was a challenge. Mr. Trump tries to walk back entitlement comments as Democrats pounce. Mr. Trump's understanding that entitlement programs, particularly those for older Americans, are a political landmine was clear in 2016 when he broke with other candidates vying for the Republican presidential nomination and promised unequivocally to protect Social Security. At the time, Mr. Trump was also blunt about the political realities of cutting safety net programs, noting that Democrats want to bolster Social Security benefits for retirees. Republican lawmakers who consider themselves fiscal conservatives have long wanted to restructure America's safety net programs, but they have generally held their tongues under Mr. Trump. Surgeon General says shocking portion of people aren't told to stop smoking. Vulnerable populations in particular are not getting the help they need to stop smoking, it said, and recommended that doctors and public health officials devote more attention to offering smoking cessation assistance to gay and transgendered people, Native Americans, people with mental illness diagnosis, and several other groups with high smoking rates. Chris Bostick, Deputy Director for Policy at the Action on Smoking and Health, said, "I believe society has withheld or restricted access to cessation because smokers did it to themselves, but Nearly all smokers became addicted as children when they could not have consented to the risk. More than 55 years after the first Surgeon General's report warned that smoking causes cancer, it remains the leading cause of preventable death and disease in the United States, even as Dr. Adams cautioned that there is no scientific evidence on the effectiveness of e-cigarettes as smoking cessation tools. He said, "We've heard powerful accounts from adults out there who tell us that they've used e-cigarettes to successfully transition from combustible cigarettes." In the fall, President Trump agreed to ban most flavored e-cigarettes to keep them away from minors. Seeing a Bloomberg ad on Fox News, Trump takes the bait. Trump fears Bloomberg because Bloomberg is actually the guy who Trump played on TV, a fantastically wealthy, self-made success with unlimited resources and a willingness to spend it, said David Axelrod, a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. Howard Wolfson, an advisor to Mr. Bloomberg, said that Mr. Trump has been essentially running unopposed until Mike entered the race. While other Democrats are fighting and sniping with one another in Iowa, we are running a nationwide campaign that is taking the fight directly to President Trump on issues where he is extremely vulnerable, he said. As for Mr. Trump's nickname for Mr. Bloomberg, Minnie, Mr. Wolfson called it irrelevant and said, "If you want to think about small, Trump could fit in Mike's pocket. The stature gap, the wealth gap, the success gap, the experience gap, the achievement gap between these two men is vast." The Bloomberg campaign has been ratcheting up its attacks as Mr. Trump has reacted to the spending. Caucusing in the Caucasus. In just 11 days, Mr. Kucera will host the first Iowa caucus in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. More than 1,700 people have signed up to participate at a satellite caucus location, according to the state party. All of the out-of-state results will be bundled into one at-large satellite caucus county. For the campaigns, the expanded caucus map presents new organizing opportunity. Marianne Williamson says she'll support Andrew Yang in Iowa. On Thursday, the billionaire Tom Steyer, who Mr. Yang publicly supported at an earlier debate, argued for Mr. Yang's inclusion in the February contest. Though Mr. Yang must earn just 5% support in forthcoming qualifying polls to make the February debate, he will need to amass 15% support in a congressional district to earn delegates that count toward winning the party's nomination, a steep climb so close to the first nominating contest. Aside from expressing her support for Mr. Yang, Ms. Williamson also used her Instagram post to outline her views on the remaining field of Democratic candidates and on issues and characteristics that are important to her. Pillowcase rapist who terrorized Florida in the 1980s has been caught, officials say. The key break in the case came last year, Ms. Rundle said, when Mr. Kohler's son was arrested on a felony domestic violence charge, requiring him to submit a DNA sample to a criminal database. After Mr. Kohler's son was arrested last year, triggering the familial match, the police placed Mr. Kohler under surveillance. The authorities, armed with a search warrant, then collected a more complete DNA sample from Mr. Kohler's mouth that linked him to 24 other sexual assault cases from the 1980s, Ms. Rundle said. Ousted from Washington, ex-spy Valerie Plame asked voters to send her back. An apology is not enough, especially since Plame has a history of sharing articles from the same source. Mr. Pick said, Ms. Plame said she spoke Greek, German, and French, linguistic skills she honed in the CIA. But after living in New Mexico for more than a decade, some voters complain that she cannot speak much Spanish, nor pronounce Spanish surnames and place names the way many longtime New Mexicans do, whether they are Hispanic, Anglo, or Native. Valerie is a gracious person who asked for my support, said Roger Montoya, 58, a community leader and co-founder of a youth center in Española, north of Santa Fe. But we have centuries and centuries of lineage and culture that have informed us in a unique way. Mr. Montoya said he was supporting Ms. Ledger Fernandez in the race, adding of Ms. Plame, she's obviously an outsider who doesn't know our culture firsthand. Still, though the district has long been viewed as a Hispanic bastion, it actually has fewer Hispanics on a proportional basis than the relatively conservative district stretching across southern New Mexico, which flipped from red to blue in 2018. How the Grammys and Deborah Dugan went from hello to war in 5 months. The Academy said that Ms. Dugan had been accused of bullying behavior by an assistant and then sought a $22 million payout to go quietly, a charge Ms. Dugan denied. The Academy said this week that it had started independent investigations into Ms. Dugan's potential misconduct and her subsequent allegations, but questioned why she never raised these grave allegations until a week after legal claims were made against her personally. On Thursday, Ms. Dugan appeared on the ABC and CBS morning shows, giving her first interviews since filing her complaint. In her complaint, Ms. Dugan alleged that board members sometimes manipulate the nominations process by elevating certain acts they were associated with, and that names were added at the whim of the Grammy's longtime producer, Ken Elrick, over the votes of the Academy's rank-and-file members. Pope Francis replaces conservative Archbishop of Philadelphia. Francis recently acknowledged that a good deal of the opposition to his pontificate emanated from the United States, telling a reporter who handed him a book exploring the well-financed and media-backed American effort to undermine his agenda that it was an honor that the Americans attacked me. Archbishop Chaput's departure was expected, and he had offered his resignation to Pope Francis when he turned 75 in September. In a June 2017 interview, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller, then the top doctrinal watchdog of in the Roman Catholic Church, said he was disappointed that the Archbishop of Philadelphia had not been elevated to cardinal, because the appointment of the cardinals should not be a personal relation with the Pope to these bishops. Asked why Francis had declined to make the appointment, he said, "Politics." Weeks later, Francis removed Cardinal Müller from his position. Archbishop Chaput removed priests accused of abuse, closed 49 schools, and sold the Archbishop's mansion for $10 million as part of a plan to reduce the operating budget deficit. Andy Byford's work is not done. In a resignation letter, Mr. Byford seemed to suggest that he was leaving in part because of a restructuring of the MTA engineered by Mr. Cuomo that reduced Mr. Byford's authority, removing major subway construction projects from his domain. At a news conference Thursday, Mr. Cuomo called Mr. Byford a good man who has done a lot of good over the past 2 years. He described the relationship as fine. The governor defended the MTA restructuring, but acknowledged that it had changed Mr. Byford's job. Strap hangers had become so fond of him that they nicknamed him Train Daddy. The name appears to have derived from a street art featuring Mr. Byford's head attached to a train, along with the words, "Train Daddy loves you very much." Anyone who watched Mr. Byford at work could see why New Yorkers trusted him. Day 3 of Mr. Trump's trial, the legal seminar. Even Representative Matt Gaetz, the devoted Trump cheerleader from Florida, observed early this week that thus far the Democrats' presentation looked as though it was cable news, while the president's defense team looked like an 8th grade's book report. That said, while Wednesday's narrative of presidential scheming and obstruction was a nonstop pile-on of damning testimony and other hard evidence, Thursday's arguments began with a lengthy seminar by one of the House managers, Representative Jerry Nadler, on the framers' intent regarding impeachment. Kicking off the day's presentation, Representative Adam Schiff, the lead House manager, warned senators that there would be of necessity some repetition and begged their forbearance. There is, he promised, some method to our madness. The day had its fresh spots, including a 1999 clip of Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Mr. Trump's fiercest defenders, sharing his take on the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. Doesn't even have to be a crime. It's just when you start using your office and you're acting in a way that hurts people, you've committed a high crime. Alas, Mr. Graham was not present in the chamber for his star return. Not to be outdone, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas took to Twitter midday Thursday with his stab at impeachment comedy, Hour 23 of redundant impeachment arguments. For those following at home, drinking game. Every time House Dems say drug deal or get over it, drink a shot of milk. The milk crack was presumably a reference to the fact that water and milk are the only beverages allowed on the Senate floor during the trial. Trump is abusing his tariff power. 2. Canadian aluminum poses a national security risk? Really? And so it was that in 2018, the Trump administration announced that it was beginning a Section 232 investigation of auto imports, especially from Europe and Japan. So how should we think about the auto tariff saga? At one level, it's part of a broader story of Trump's trade war, which has raised prices for American consumers, hurt U.S. businesses and farmers, and deterred business investment by creating uncertainty. Trump's scofflaw behavior with regard to auto tariffs is part of a broader pattern of abuse of power and contempt for the rule of law. Joe Biden is stronger than you think. Go back to the early months of Joe Biden's presidential campaign and read what the consultants and commentators were saying about him. His support is just name recognition. He'll fade. He is too old. He's running a zombie campaign. The party has moved left and he's out of touch. He voted for the crime bill. Almost everyone was bearish on Joe. Biden's campaign is completely focused on the central problem of 2020, that Donald Trump is a steaming hot mess in the middle of national life. Biden keeps his moderate credentials when many other candidates saw AOC on Twitter and decided to move left. DNA collection at the border threatens the privacy of all Americans. Today, all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government collect, store, and share genetic information through CODIS, or CODIS. Initially, many states limited DNA collection to sex offenders. Nearly all states compel DNA from all convicted felons, while many states collect DNA from individuals convicted of mere misdemeanors. What if the government gets things wrong? A comprehensive DNA database may lead law enforcement to lean even more heavily on genetic technology. Is America ready for another outbreak? The World Health Organization has convened an emergency meeting and has been considering declaring the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. Responses to emerging viral threats such as SARS and later Ebola have been controversial. The major public health and biomedical agencies, such as the National Institutes of Health and its constituent institutes, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Food and Drug Administration, are led by well-respected scientists and public health officials. One option for quality control of scientific output in a public health emergency is a rapid peer review entity, perhaps co-managed by major research institutions and funded by global health funding entities, such as the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Talking to boys and girls about sex. Peggy Orenstein asks us to reassess how we talk to boys about sex. She's right in how difficult this is, how important it is to include girls, how young men want good guidance, and how valuable frankness is. How can we talk about sex without a consideration of love? How can we address the distorted images of love and sex in entertainment media? How can we not give frank guidance about love in a culture so saturated in sex? How can we not recognize our need to truly understand love? This really isn't hard. Adam Schiff's case for conviction, a tour de force. We are leaving out a particularly able, intelligent, articulate, and tough Democrat who could really go head-to-head against President Trump. At Davos, President Trump said, "Honestly, we have all the material. They don't have the material." In doing so, he openly admitted to obstruction of justice. It seems only fair that those presidential candidates who do not have to be in attendance at President Trump's impeachment trial cease their on-the-ground campaigning until all candidates have equal opportunity for handshaking, baby holding, door knocking, kafik lashing, etc. Max Frankel, dining without the din. I am the benighted editor who many years ago asked the Times food critics to assess, among other things, the noise level in reviewed restaurants. I discovered that I and a few others past middle age no longer enjoyed shouting over their entree, and that conversation, and some distance from the conversation at neighboring tables, contributed mightily to the enjoyment of the finest dishes. That your current critic prefers distracting noises and digests better in a din is understandable. He does not pay for his nightly ventures out, and in fact is paid for obsessive concentration on the dishes before him. He may have been so preoccupied that it never occurs to him that some folks incur the cost of restaurants because they want to savor the chatter of friends and hear the sound of breaking bread. A good critic is also a good reporter, and he is not required to be deaf to the concerns of other diners. In the world's richest country, and one in which we throw away a distressingly large amount of our food, why should we deny government help to the hungry? Even if they are able-bodied, let's feed them, not punish them. A punitive attitude toward those who need food is nothing to take pride in. The acquisition of the biographer Robert Caro's papers by the New York Historical Society is like the acquisition of Julia Child's kitchen by the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Julia has outlines of her pots and pans on the walls, and Mr. Caro has outlines of his book chapters in his office, presumably to be included in the Historical Society's exhibition. Both people demonstrated their organizational skills with precision. My motto: eat first, then read. She's 91 and being kicked out of her apartment. Gabriel Wagner, 91, moved into the Riverview Senior Independent Living Facility last April after her identical twin, whom she lived with, died in 2018. New York City is in the grips of an affordable housing crunch for seniors. The latest data shows an estimate 200,000 low-income seniors were on waiting lists for federally subsidized housing in 2016 citywide, and middle-income seniors are also struggling to find homes that fit their needs. A banner reading "Now Available Senior Residence" can be seen at the top of the facade of the Riverview Senior Residence. New York City stores must accept cash, council says. Being forced to pay that way rather than having the option of using cash may soon be illegal in New York City. The city's Department of Consumer Affairs said last year that 1 in 9 New York households did not have a bank account, and 1 in 5 were underbanked, meaning they had a checking or savings account but relied on something other than a bank to cash a check. The company reversed course last year, saying that limiting how customers could pay had the unintended consequence of excluding those who prefer to pay cash or can only pay with cash. Another restaurant chain that operates in New York City and does not accept cash, Dos Toros Taqueria, declined to comment on the passage of the cashless store ban. Fairway is so crowded, how can it be in bankruptcy? These guys caused them to open stores that maybe were completely ill-advised. The rapid growth brought new challenges for a company that has never managed a regional chain, which required a reliable roster of suppliers and complicated logistics to stock stores with perishables, the main revenue driver at Fairway, before they spoiled. M. William Macy Jr., managing partner and founder of Sterling Investment Partners, said in a statement that the private equity group invested in Fairway to provide liquidity sought by the family owners and to support their and management's objective to expand Fairway's platform. Sterling, he said, assisted Fairway through a consensual reorganization supported by the company's management, owners, and creditors, in which all employees, including union employees, were retained, all vendors were fully paid, all stores remained open, and the company was left well capitalized under its new owners. Sterling had no involvement with Fairway after its 2016 reorganization, Mr. Macy said. At the branch in Woodland Park, New Jersey, you could hit a golf ball from that fairway over to the shop right, said John T. Nicolai, the president of Local 464A of the UFCW, which represents grocery workers at Fairway locations in New Jersey. Wells Fargo ex-chief fined $17.5 million over fake accounts. Wells Fargo's former chief executive, John G. Stumpf, was fined $17.5 million, the largest individual fine in the history of the bank's main federal regulator, for his role in a toxic sales culture that foisted unwanted products and sham bank accounts on millions of customers. Two former traders for the bank have faced criminal charges, and the bank as a whole has paid nearly $44 billion in penalties since the financial crisis. But none of the enforcement actions against the bank have been directed at Mr. Diamond personally. Bank of America has paid $76 billion in fines since the crisis, the most by any bank, but its chief executive during the 2008 panic, Kenneth D. Lewis, shelled out $0 to federal regulators despite presiding over the bank's abuses of mortgage borrowers and its acquisition of the mortgage lender Countrywide Financial, another abuser. Jeff Bezos' hack inquiry falls short of implicating National Enquirer. The report offers one explanation of how the National Enquirer, a tabloid, obtained and published text messages Bezos had sent to his mistress, CNBC reported. In September of 2018, Michael Sanchez began providing all materials and information to our reporters. Any suggestion that a third party was involved in or in any way influenced our reporting is false. After federal agents and prosecutors examined allegations of wrongdoing by American media in connection with the Bezos story last year, the company provided evidence showing them that Ms. Sanchez had provided text messages and compromising photos of Mr. Bezos to her brother, who passed them along to the tabloid, according to 4 people with the knowledge of the situation. The Enquirer's story about the Bezos affair, including intimate text messages sent by Mr. Bezos and photographs of the couple on the terrace of what the tabloid described as Ms. Sanchez's love nest, upset the company's majority investors, according to 2 people with knowledge of American media. Jeff Bezos, tabloid man. After the Enquirer reporting, Mr. Bezos said he had opened up an investigation into how the paper acquired the messages, hinting that Saudi Arabia may have been involved because of his ownership of the Washington Post. Mr. Bezos remains deeply engaged with his work at Amazon and committed to the mission of the Washington Post, Mr. Carney said. Mr. Bezos retained 75% of their Amazon stock and all their ownership of the Post and Blue Origin. How China's virus outbreak could threaten the global economy. On the minds of many in China and around the world right now, could this new virus cause the same kind of damage as the SARS epidemic, which killed 800 people in 2003? The question is a crucial one beyond China, because the Chinese economy has for years been one of the world's most powerful growth engines. China's growth in 2003 plunged briefly during the height of SARS, but came roaring back in a time when global companies were building Chinese factories and exporting more and more goods abroad. Today, China's economy is bigger, but is growing at its slowest pace in nearly 3 decades. Families spent the past year watching prices rise in grocery stores, increases due largely to the outbreak of a pig disease that depleted much of China's pork supply. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin takes a jab at Greta Thunberg at Davos. Ms. Thunberg, a Swedish climate activist who has led demonstrations around the world, spoke at the forum on Tuesday and urged business leaders to stop investing in fossil fuels immediately. His only reference to a climate activist was to describe them as heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers. They predicted an overpopulation crisis in the 1960s, a mass starvation in the 70s, and an end of oil in the 90s, he said, as Ms. Thunberg listened from the 6th row, where she sat with 3 other climate activists. Soon after Time magazine named her Person of the Year for her work around climate change, Mr. Trump commented on social media, "Greta must work on her anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Chill, Greta, chill," she quickly responded. Climate change could blow up the economy. Banks aren't ready. Christine Lagarde, the central bank's president, who took office late last year, has pledged to put climate change on the bank's agenda. and the issue will play an important role as the ECB embarks on its first comprehensive review since 2003 of how it conducts monetary policy. Commercial banks might become superfluous and fail, leaving central banks to become, in effect, giant retail banks. In the worst case scenario, central banks may have to intervene as climate rescuers of last resort, or as some sort of collective insurer for climate damages, said the Bank for International Settlements report. How tech taxes became the world's hottest economic debate. Setting a minimum tax for companies around the world to prevent them from hiding profits in tax havens will make a much bigger difference, he said. These are all wrapped up in one question of how do we adjust a tax system that is 100 years old in order to tax the digital economy. Kimberly Clausing, an economist at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, who specializes in international taxation and has pushed for additional measures to tax corporate profits around the world, said the digital tax effort exposed political and economic tensions in wealthy nations. Some countries are going to have to give up taxing rights in order to allow other countries to have them. And the question is who, said J. Clark Armitage, a former Internal Revenue Service official and the president of the tax firm Kaplan and Drysdale in Washington. In this founder gets 5.5 years in prison in opioid kickback scheme. A federal judge sentenced John Kapoor, the founder of the opioid manufacturer Insys Therapeutics, to 5.5 years in prison Thursday for his role in a racketeering scheme that bribed doctors to prescribe a highly addictive opiate and misled insurers. On Wednesday, the judge sentenced the company's former chief executive, Michael L. Babich, 43, of Scottsdale, Arizona, to 30 months in prison and 3 years of supervised release. Other executives who were sentenced include Sunrise Lee, a former regional sales director, who was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison, Joseph A. Rowan, another former regional sales director, who was sentenced to 27 months in prison, and Richard M. Simon, a former national director of sales, who was sentenced to 33 months in prison. Reagan Arthur named publisher at Knopf. Alfred A. Knopf announced Thursday that Reagan Arthur is the new publisher, succeeding Sonny Mehta, who died at 77 in December after more than 3 decades at the helm of the august literary imprint. I worked with a couple of them way back when in our early days, she said, referring to the start of her career at the publisher St. Martin's. And there's not an editor there whose books I haven't read at one point or another and loved. The publisher also said Thursday that Maya Mavji is the new president and publisher for the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group. Arthur has seen up close the many changes in publishing industry over recent years. She cited the rise of ebooks and audiobooks as two of the most momentous, as well as the increase of competing claims on readers' attention. The key to succeeding in that environment, she said, is having the material itself, and obviously the great tradition of Knopf is these incredible writers and voices. Given how few people have sat atop Knopf, its publishers tend to become synonymous with its already iconic name. Editor who sharpened Daily News is picked to revive Deadspin. GO Media, Deadspin's owner, said Mr. Rich would work in Chicago, where Deadspin recently moved after 15 years in New York. Jim Spanfeller, GO Media's chief executive, praised Mr. Rich in a statement, saying his extensive experience as a reporter and editor will enable him to rebuild and lead Deadspin into the future. That ability is also likely to depend on Mr. Spanfeller, who has been running GO Media since April when the Boston private equity firm, Great Hill Partners, bought Deadspin along with several other sites that Gawker Media once owned, including Jezebel, Gizmodo, and Lifehacker. Laura Wagner, a former Deadspin writer who covered media and who posted a long Deadspin article in August about GO Media's management, said, "I understand media is a tough industry, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that people may be desperate for jobs." But she said she doubted that ex-Deadspinners would rejoin the site under current management. That's not going to happen. Mapping potholes by phone, the West Bank's roads were smoother. The students' test users have already come up with some surprising data. The roads around Massachusetts Institute of Technology are worse than the roads around Berzett University. Smooth roads last longer, Mr. Engstrom said, and that definitely helps both the environment and our pocketbook. Upon his return from the West Bank, Professor bemoaned the lack of roughness index data on these roads to another engineering professor, Argavan Luggalam of the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Isolating the movement caused by a bumpy road takes some sophisticated math, but in the end, Cardin's estimates of road quality compare favorably with the measurements taken with those laser-equipped vans. As states add money to fix roads, U.S. is urged to ante up. We're falling behind due to poor condition of the nation's highways. Federal spending on road infrastructure is struggling to keep up. Federal lawmakers staved off a cut to the National Highway Trust Fund last year that would have pulled $7.6 billion away from the state highway budgets. The ballot results are a great reminder infrastructure investment remains one of the few areas where red states, blue states, Republicans, and Democrats can all come together. David Bauer, president of the American Roads and Transportation Builders Association, said in a statement, along with the ballot initiatives passed to support highway projects, states could take a bigger role in their own infrastructure destinies. China poised to buy more from the U.S. at the expense of U.S. allies. Many trade experts have long urged the American government to put up a unified front with the European companies and others that have complained about China's trade practices. The published text of last week's argument set clear numerical targets for large increases in American exports to China in 4 categories: manufactured goods, agriculture, energy, and services. China's trade with Europe has been more balanced, in part because Europe has often been seen as a politically safer choice in Beijing, given China's often rocky relationship with the United States. And that is Read in the Times for Friday, January 24th, 2020.